Good afternoon to you all from Copenhagen and the German-Danish Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to today's online event on perspectives for 2022 and beyond. The idea behind this format is that we want to give you an expert view on a few issues that are discussed in Germany, Denmark and indeed throughout the world. I'm quite excited about the speakers that we can present today. We have two speakers from Germany and two speakers from Denmark. What you see is the speaking order, which I'm also going to use to present our speakers. From Frankfurt, we are joined by Heike Göbel, who is economics editor at Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. The FAZ, as we call it in German, is arguably the most influential paper in Germany. At our studio, I am joined by Philipp Schröder, who is professor at Arhus University. Philipp has been on many expert committees for Danish governments and knows the country very well, although he speaks Danish with a German accent. From Berlin, we are joined by my colleague Melanie Vogelbach. Melanie is Director of International Economic Policy at the Association of German Chambers of Commerce. That means that Melanie has an eye on trade policy and the global business cycle, to name just two issues. Last but not least, we have Lars Las Olsen here at our studio, Chief Economist at Danske Bank, a major player, if not the major player, in Danish banking. Lars is head of a large department of economists that keep track of all kinds of developments and markets, of course. Each of our experts has a different job and thereby view of business perspectives, which is why we want to start by putting one question to each of our panelists. After about 30 minutes, we want to go over to discussion and include you, our audience. Please post questions via Zoom. And one last organizational issue, we are recording the event so that you can access this discussion again. Before we get going, I want to give you a bit of background on the situation in Germany and Denmark. In both countries, GDP went down in 2020, of course, but the difference between Germany and Denmark is quite big. Denmark actually tops the Economist's list of countries that have weathered the pandemic best. The forecasts are for solid growth in both Germany and Denmark in 2022. The development of unemployment is a great success in both countries. I must add that these figures are from national statistics and that they are not harmonized. But the point here is that labor markets are increasingly tight. Last but not least, inflation has become one of the huge issues. It is going up, but it is going up by less in Denmark because Denmark is not as dependent on international energy markets as Germany is. We will definitely talk about what the consequences will be for us. That is the background in a few diagrams and figures of today's debate. I want to start by putting the first question to Heike Göbel. Heike, hello to Frankfurt. Thank you for joining us.
Hello from Frankfurt to Denmark, to Copenhagen.
Thank you, Heike. Well, the first question that we have actually agreed on to you, what do you see as Germany's challenges ahead in the medium and long term? And how is the new German, the traffic light government dealing with them? Is the government's plan adequate?
Oh, a lot of broad questions and big questions. Let me just briefly start with the short-term challenge, because we are still struggling with getting back to normal business after COVID, and there is the looming Ukraine crisis, which brought up a new subject and is looked at with a lot of fear that the Ukraine crisis could aggravate our energy cost problem you just mentioned, Rainer Perel. But concerning middle term or structural challenges, of course, if COVID is over and hopefully the Ukraine crisis is solved somehow without troubling us and the rest of Europe too much, there are four structural challenges which Germany is facing for quite some time now, but I think they cannot be overlooked and ignored any longer. The first one is Germany's demography. Baby boomers are retiring in the next year with rather comfortable pensions. That means the smaller, younger cohorts face a huge financial burden paying those pensions and care for the elderly. And of course, in the labor market, companies already start feeling the strain. There's a looming labor shortage, and especially of high qualified workers, but also on young school leavers willing to take up an apprenticeship and become skilled craftsmen. The second big challenge is digitalization. Germany's digital shortcomings, obvious not only in international rankings, became very visible during the pandemic. Schools were and are not adequately fitted for remote teaching. Teachers still have to use private laptops, not all, but some. My cousin who's teaching in Thuringia just told me that she's still using her own private laptop, and that she has to overcome a lot of data safety restrictions concerned with that. So teachers are still not in really fit teaching remote. Public health administration is unable to keep track with COVID infections due to insufficient digitalization, and people in the countryside were struggling with weak WLAN in home office. The third big question and challenge is, of course, decarbonization. It's not a unique German problem, of course, if we have to, the whole world has to solve it together, but Germany is following a spectacular Sonderweg, I would call it a singular path to decarbonize the country, which brings about expensive additional hurdles. We are stopping the use of nuclear fission by the end of this year, and we are trying to quit the use of coal till 2030 now, latest by 2038. And that means we have to solve the big problem, where will we get enough renewable energy? At the moment, renewables cover only 17% of German energy use. So you can see how big the challenge is. The last challenge is heavily interwoven with the first three: modernizing infrastructure and overcoming Germany's core problem, overly long planning procedures. We have a lot of red tape and rather elaborate public consultation procedures, which prevent fast progress almost everywhere in infrastructure. So we are trying to get the grids, bringing the wind energy from north to the south, where all the industrial sites are, and we are struggling to make the grid fit for transporting the electricity, because people don't want the grids in their backyard, they don't want them overground, and now politicians promised to lay them underground, but now they found out that people don't want them underground as well. So we will have a lot of costs putting them underground, and still there are protests underway blocking those grids. Another problem is building railroads. It can easily take 30 years or more to build them, or from the planning till we have built them. So one side of the Gotthard Tunnel, the Swiss part, is already quite fit for more transport of goods. The German side will take 20 years longer to build those railroads. We need to make use of the modernized Gotthard Tunnel. And the same thing with the Fehmarnbelt Tunnel. On the German side, we had about more than 12,000 objections against building the Fehmarnbelt Tunnel. On the Danish side, as I was told, were only 50. So how is the new German government answering these problems? Three rather different partners joined forces, but each is still pursuing his own agenda with a special effort. So due to Social Democrats' pressure, the new coalition chooses to ignore the demographic challenge. It has no ambition to get real reform done on that. It just signaling we are stabilizing pensions and social security contributions with higher transfer from the federal budget, which will be difficult because the federal budget is already very much subsidizing the pension system. And of course, after COVID, we don't have enough money for that. Very troubling is, in my opinion, that they are still aiming to broaden the welfare state. The new coalition will give more subsidies to families. They will have to find out how to sort of subsidize healthcare and the care of elderly. And of course, then there is the social demographic hard project, higher minimum wage, which of course the government doesn't have to pay for, but almost half of the companies in the country. So if in October the minimum wage will be risen by about 20%, 6 million people could profit by that. But yeah, you never know if unemployment will rise and people will keep their jobs. Mostly to green pressure, climate action has become the other top priority of the government. The former Green leader, Robert Habeck, is in charge, leading the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. He wants and he has to triple the rate of emission reductions to deliver what Germany aims for. He has to speed up installation of wind turbines and solar panels, and of course, building those grids nobody wants in his backyard. And the Liberal Democrats, they made digitalization and modernization of the infrastructure their priority, extraordinarily difficult in a federal state with mixed responsibilities, where part of the digital efforts has to be digital, delivering public services online. And of course, there is the local level, the state level, and the federal level. They all have to be closely interacting to promote and supply those services online. And it's very difficult to bring them together. The Liberals have also voted to keep Germany fiscally solid. This is why the finance minister is from the Liberal Party, Christian Lindner. And of course, this is a huge task after Corona. To sum up, the new coalition has got many priorities right, but everyone is wondering how things will add up financially, especially if the demographic challenge is ignored and the social system is expanded further. So I could just stop here. I think I used my 5 minutes more than I should.
Thank you very much, Heike Göbel. I'm pretty sure we will get back to the challenges that you have expressed or that you have named for Germany. But first, let us jump into Denmark and into Danish problems. But the same question really to you, Philipp Schröder. What do you see as Denmark's challenges going forward, medium, long term? And is the government dealing with the problems, or how is it dealing with the problems?
Yeah, it's a fascinating and important discussion, really, and particularly this question about challenges and are they addressed is I think what really is lacking to some extent in the Danish public debate as we speak. But maybe an interesting observation, if you look at Heike's shortlist, the absence of certain issues in the Danish economy is actually quite surprising. There's no discussion and no reason to discuss digitalization, for example, or fiscal stability. So a couple of things that are on the to-do list for the German government are already done in Denmark. But having said that, I think there's a couple of major issues that are lurking in the background in Denmark. And one thing you have shown the unemployment figures earlier, right? So we are at the verge of something economists could call for overheating. And in Denmark, we have a very nasty cocktail here that we have a sizable public sector. Mind you that out of 2.9 million Danes that are in employment, it's 2.9 million, I think that's the number of unemployed in Germany. So that gives you some idea of the size difference between the two countries. We have 2.9 million in employment, about a small million in the public sector, so which is 30%. I think in Germany that compares to something like 12% in the public sector employment. So, and this is because there's a fantastic welfare state. It works very well. Everything is up and running. It also explains why it is a high-tax country and all these issues. But what is the real problem here is that it's uncertain if this system is actually ready to continue into the future unbalanced. We have had tremendous reform efforts that were successful, like increasing pension age. And right now, with that overheating in the private sector showing up, you fear something I would call a null-sum game, a zero-sum game between public and private sector. So there is a decided shortage. And of course, what is the answer to that cocktail of problems? Because you don't want to unwind the very well-functioning welfare system. And you have a reform track history on increasing pension age that you try to keep momentum on. But the real answer is public sector productivity, really, as is private sector productivity. And here it's very hard to see where that agenda is currently. So there are tremendous reform efforts in Denmark trying to go into that direction. But for me, that is the biggest building site in the Danish economy. How do you create the foundations to maintain that Danish welfare state model? Because it's a well-functioning system, but it doesn't come for free, and you have to maintain it as you go along, and that's certainly on the agenda. And we have had that discussion barely open up in Denmark, to my mind. I think that's one of the big building sites. And another thing that shows up in Denmark is maybe also I'm sure we're going to talk more about inflation in a minute. But the exchange rate system in Denmark sort of creates a potential tension for the country, which is currently not a problem. It will not be a problem in 2022, but going ahead, because if we see a normalization of inflation patterns throughout Europe, or we see an average of 2% that is composed, let's say, from low inflation in this part of Europe and high inflation in other parts, then Denmark is going to gain competitiveness, and that's going to be an imbalance in the European system. That if you run your own currency, it's not dangerous, but you're drawing attention to the economy that you don't want to draw to the economy, basically. So that's another thing. We hardly speak about it, and it's hard to tell where there is a solution to that issue. And an extension to that is really my maybe most fundamental observation of a concern for the Danish economy is that Denmark has always been and still is very lukewarm on Europe. And so even before joining the European Union and after Brexit, it's sort of standing alone on that party now and has no one to talk to in a sense. And that's not a good place because nothing in this economy can be made and is basically viable unless it's integrated in a single market, unless it's integrated in basically in the European punching weight that you get by ganging up with other countries in Europe. And Denmark has been a bit of an onlooker, and I have a hard time seeing that this is changing with the current political winds that are blowing in Denmark. No one is taking that pro-European approach that serves Denmark so well. I mean, mind you, it's one of the richest economies we have in the world and in Europe.
Very open economy.
Highly open economy. It's trading basically everything that is produced in Denmark from January to July is sold to the outside world, right? And that needs an international network that works. And Denmark doesn't really show up to make that structure also be safe for the years ahead. I think these are, for me, the main issues. The how to secure the Danish welfare state going forward, how to navigate in a higher inflation environment with your own currency, and last but not least, get into the game in terms of joining Europe properly and don't be an onlooker.
Okay, there are obviously many follow-up questions in what you said, but we're gonna switch to Berlin, to Melanie Vogelbach at the Association of German Chambers of Industry and Commerce. Hello, Melanie.
Hello from Berlin.
Yes, there are differences, of course, between the German and Danish economy, and one particular German issue is supply chain problems, really. Germany having this large industrial sector that is so dependent on the outside world. And especially the German car manufacturers have run into problems, but also all kinds of machinery producers and many other companies have gotten into trouble. Melanie, can you tell us what the situation is and when it will get her, and maybe also what this means for neighboring countries like Denmark, because we're talking a lot about these German problems here, and many in Denmark see this as an opportunity.
Of course. So hello from Berlin. Thank you so much for having me. As you said, international supply chain problems are really one of the major issues that the German companies face at the moment. German industry, as you said, is very much diversified and very integrated, not only in the European, but also in the global supply chains. And so because of that, Germany is much more than other countries, much more than Denmark, affected by the global supply chain issues that we've been seeing in not only in the last year, they actually started in 2020. And unfortunately, recently, and in the last couple of months, we've not really seen much of an improvement of the situation. It has indeed actually worsened to the extent that not only certain industry branches were affected. You mentioned the automobile industry. Of course, for them it is a major issue, but at the moment we do really see that it is across all sectors, all branches of the economy, and all sizes of companies that are affected by these supply chain issues. So companies are waiting for several months for important primary products that they need for their production, and they're paying much higher prices. That is due to the lack of certain products. Of course, it's computer chips, semiconductors, but also important raw materials that have become much more expensive. And then, of course, Heike Göbel mentioned the high energy prices, which are an important issue for German companies as well. So we've been seeing that at the moment, and we see in our surveys as DIHK, we regularly survey all German companies across all sectors and sizes in Germany. And we've been seeing that high commodity and energy prices remain one of the largest business risks for future development. So given that, Heike Göbel mentioned all the long-term or medium-term challenges that we face in Germany, which is absolutely true. Digitalization, the demography, and the huge challenge of decarbonizing our economy. But in the short term, actually, we still are dealing with the corona crisis. We do still have several sectors of the German economy that are still affected by measures to combat the corona crisis. So that's largely the services industry. And then in the production industry, we do have all these supply chain issues. So we're hopeful for the year 2022, but the situation is a little bit clouded starting off this year because of this these challenges. The industry is still doing relatively well in Germany, but of course, because of those issues, not as well as they could be doing, and maybe should be doing, growing out of a crisis and making up for the losses that we had in 2020. You showed the statistics in the beginning. So there was a much heavier hit to the German economy than to Denmark's. And so there's still a lot to make up for. So we predict more or less by the mid of 2022 that we will get back to pre-crisis level. But of course, there have been major losses that haven't been made up for in the meantime. So hopefully mid 2022, as I said, we will be back to pre-crisis level, but the supply chain issues certainly will be accompanying us for the entire year. Maybe just quickly with regards to your other question, what implications all that has for neighboring countries, also like Denmark. Well, on the one hand, we're going to talk about inflation, the prices for the products that German companies are buying from abroad. are rising, and so also, of course, many companies have to also sell the products abroad to higher prices when they have the finished product. So inflation is rising here, but also it might have an effect on other countries. But also there's the question of changing supply chains, and we've been getting this question quite a lot. Are companies now, because of the instability of supply chains or all the challenges, are they reshoring all their production on all their supply chains back to Germany, back to Europe? We don't necessarily see that everybody is changing their production sites back to Germany or Europe. As we heard earlier, it's important that we work together in Europe, but also globally. And it doesn't always make sense to produce everything here at home. We do rely on imports, but also on exports. In Germany, we have a quarter of all jobs depend on exports, and in the industry, it's actually half of all jobs. So that might not be the solution, but we do see that companies are looking at their supply chains, and many of them are looking for new suppliers. And of course, when they find good, reliable and new suppliers in the neighborhood, then they're happy to work with them. So of course, that can also be a chance for countries like Denmark or other neighbors. Maybe just one point which we can maybe come back to later. One major challenge we also see are protectionist tendencies, and so I really like the appeal of gaining up with other countries. We have the G7 presidency in Germany this year, and with all the challenges that we have in the short, but also in the medium and long term, I think it's very important to emphasize that we have to work together, and it's not the solution to close borders or to raise duties and with protectionism make these problems even worse that we see at the moment.
Okay, well, thank you, Melanie Vogelbach. I might add that we at the Chamber of Commerce do have the impression from more or less anecdotal evidence that more German companies are asking for suppliers. I don't know if this stands up to science or a broader survey, but it is our impression that more German companies are asking us for Danish suppliers. On that note, back to Denmark and our financial markets specialist Lars. Thank you for being here. Well, my question to you would be: many markets are strained as a consequence of the pandemic, and of also because of stepped up efforts to decarbonize economies. Energy prices are fueling inflation, labor markets are tight. What will be the outcome for economies, and how will monetary policy deal with all that? And yes, how harmful is inflation actually?
Yeah, big questions, of course. So you can say in Denmark we have been lucky in recent times, both in terms of the effects of COVID-19. Well, some luck, some skill maybe, but still a smaller effect than we've seen elsewhere. And also we have been, like it was mentioned, in this whole supply chain problems in the terms of the energy composition. We are hurt. Danish companies are certainly badly affected by supply problems, and also the rising energy costs are definitely hurting Danish companies. We have about 1 million people in Denmark living in homes that are heated by gas, so it's not nothing, and they are definitely having a very, very high bill this winter. But nevertheless, compared to Germany or compared to many other countries around the world, we are on the lucky side. So that's all very well, but with that also comes some issues, because in this situation where we are more lucky, and so there's less sort of crisis that, for example, government money has to compensate for. Well, nevertheless, we've had government spending during the pandemic. If you look at the accounts, you will see that Denmark has a zero deficit throughout the COVID-19 crisis, so it looks like we've been very prudent. And you can say we have, but nevertheless, that comes from a very large surplus before COVID-19. So it's still an easing. And then what the figures won't tell you is that we've had a very large off-balance sheet fiscal easing in Denmark, in the so-called holiday money being paid out. And I will not go into the technicalities of that right now, but just suffice to say that this is in fact a fiscal easing that bears comparison with what we've seen in other European countries, for a country that maybe didn't need it to the same extent. And this has created an environment today in Denmark that is very close to being overheated. It means that we have a very, very significant lack of labor, and that we are seeing increasing pressures on the economy, also increasing inflation, and I expect to see a lot more inflation also beyond the energy costs that are affecting us. So this is, and you can say, is that a bad thing? Like you mentioned, not necessarily so bad. We've had very, very low inflation for a long period, sort of lower than was the intention, which means that for all of Europe, we could have, with the benefit of hindsight, we could have had more employment and we could have had more income without going too far in terms of inflation. So that it's not so bad if we get into a period now where it's a bit higher. And if you look from the perspective of Denmark, well, we can manage with a bit higher wages. There's nothing wrong with being paid more. We all like that. And we can afford it to an extent because we have the large current account surplus and so on. We're very good competitiveness in the starting point. But of course it can go too far, and I'm concerned about the pace at which, for example, unemployment is currently declining. That can end in a overheating that lays the foundation for the next crisis. And definitely, whatever you think about it, if it's a problem or not, for the individual company trying to run a business in Denmark, it certainly is a problem. Because when you're trying to run a company in Denmark today, you are faced with the same supply problems that you are everywhere in Europe, but you're also faced with this very, very tight labor market. And it is a fact that you can go around Copenhagen now and you can see restaurants that are closed because they cannot find the employees that they need. And that's only going to continue for the next year or two. So it's not an easy time to run a business, I'm afraid, although you will benefit from very large demand for whatever it is that you are producing.
Okay. So, well, and now a big question. Is inflation like toothpaste? Which is a famous quote by a former Bundesbank chairman. Is it like toothpaste? Can we get it back into the tube?
Well, in a sense, we are doing a laboratory experiment with the world currently, because we believe and try out if quantitative tightening, as it has been christened, is a tool that can put a checks and balance on inflation. And from the evidence we have seen from the US, it doesn't look like it can. You heard the press conference today at the ECB, so you probably know better than I do. But in Europe, I think we're trying to do something that already in the US didn't work to fight inflation. So I'm worried about the toothpaste hypothesis, very much so.
And there's a lot to it. I'd like to encourage our listeners, to come with questions. There are none here at the moment. I imagine there would be questions. Just come forward, and in the meantime, we keep just discussing. Are there any questions that you have to each other, or comments on the things that have been said?
I would like to ask, how is the Danish approach towards labor shortage? What are you doing to relieving the companies? Is there any government action to have more workers from far abroad? Or
there's a very large amount of talk about it, and very little action. Currently, there is, of course, a lot of pressure to ease the rules to allow in workers. Of course, EU workers are free to come, but to ease the restrictions on workers from beyond EU, and that's currently in a political gridlock because the government is actually willing to do it to some extent, but they need the opposition, some of the right-wing opposition parties to vote for it, and they have their own plan, which has a lower threshold for the income level that you need, but then they will not accept that you come from certain countries that they don't like. So it's currently locked on that, and you can say everybody's expectations of what can actually be achieved through this program is anyway quite modest. I mean, the employment growth in the latest number we have for employment is for November, and there was an employment growth of 17,000 persons in November alone. And these kinds of programs are estimated to maybe get a few thousand people more into Denmark. And the same with other reforms that are scheduled that might sort of incentivize people to come into the workforce. Well, you know, they can maybe achieve a few thousand persons in a few years or something like that. So in reality, nothing really is happening. But one big thing is the old reforms that were already made, and I think Philipp can take some of the credit. But they are kicking in still. For example, the increase in the retirement age, that's also happening this year, and that is increasing the labor force to a significant extent. So we have some things that are helping, but really the big thing is that you need to dampen demand in order to check this situation, in my opinion.
Maybe if I may add, the current government has actually started out in the outset of its term by lowering pension age for certain groups of workers, which was unfortunate given the current temperature of the economy, but couldn't be anticipated in a sense. But so everyone has been since then in search of finding the extra, basically labor again, and there's a backlog of reform proposals that currently are debated, and there are chunks of the labor force in Denmark that are not participating. So the entire flexicurity system, which looks nice when you watch it from the outside, of course also has a hidden group of people that persistently or maybe the phrase is they're permanently on temporary transfer payments. So if you're permanently on something temporary, there's something wrong in the system, and I think that's one of the areas where there is hope to actually activate a larger part of the potential labor force again. But this is it's a long road. It's a rocky path up there.
Huge topic, yeah. And Heike, Göbel, when will reality kick in Germany, and when will reality push the government into action with regard to retirement age?
The answer is I'm not very hopeful for this for the next 4 years. I think they can point to the fact that we are still have a rising retirement age, because the aim is you retire with 67, but we are reaching there via small steps. So 67 will be the retirement age for all around about 2030 or something. So we are still in a phase where the retirement age is climbing. So they don't see any need of setting it higher, which is, I think, a pity, because if you want to sort of go a little bit higher, maybe 68, 69, you have to have 10 years or more than that to get people prepared on this aim. So they are trying, or they promised that they will make another effort with the Swedish model of a capital financed additional pension system. But there are only 10 billion euro to fund that, and this will not really will not really help, I think, in the next 10, 20 years to finance and stabilize the system anyway. Then the other answer is qualifying, getting better qualified workers, trying to tap the reserves in the German labor market, like getting more women to work full time, not half time, part time, and of course we have about 1 million long-term unemployed, like you called it, permanently on temporary payments. There's talk of qualifying them. So yeah, I think there's no real plan. They are trying to muddle through for the next 4 years, and then I think the next government maybe has to make a new attempt on pension reform.
Has an even bigger task then.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So
maybe
just
to add to that,
I
mean, what Heike Göbel said, those are the measures that are important, but in the long run, it will probably not work without a huge amount of people immigrating from outside the European Union, because in the EU, we have so many countries that face the same demographic challenges. And so, of course, there should be many efforts to get more women, maybe also older people into the workforce and long term. And companies are doing a lot to become more attractive, to make it more feasible to combine family and career, to be more attractive as a company for employees. But in the long run, we just with the demographic that we have, we do need people from outside, and quite a lot.
Okay. So there is a first question concerning inflation, really, and inflation's effect on private consumption, and when will we start seeing the effect? I don't know who wants to take this, Lars?
I can do it. Yeah. So it's of course all else equal. When inflation is higher, it lowers sort of the real income of households, and so lowers their spending. But this comes at a time when households have huge savings, because all the money that they didn't spend during the lockdown phase is sort of sitting there on their balance sheets and have not been spent. So this pulls in the other direction. And when you look at it in Denmark, so it's primarily energy costs still that are driving the inflation, and that's very, very unevenly distributed, because it primarily hits the households that have gas heating. And when you look at where are they in the country? Well, they're fortunately exactly the same places where house prices have gone up a lot. So where people have a lot of home equity. So it's sort of hurting the richer part of the population. So that's why we don't expect that this higher inflation in Denmark's case will actually have a very negative impact on sort of overall consumer spending. Then, of course, what we do expect to happen this year is that inflation will be broader, so we will start to see price increases on a lot of goods. But then that will also rub on wages, so the real income will again not be hurt as much. So we're not that pessimistic about private consumption because of this inflation, but that might be a little bit different when you look at it in a country like Germany, I expect.
Do you see it like this for Germany?
At least I think inflation is seen as a bigger problem now, much bigger problem, and I think many people. We had a poll saying that about 1/3 think that they can't handle higher prices with their income, and I think the worries about inflation among the population are, of course, traditionally higher in Germany, but now since we haven't seen inflation for so many years, it's sort of it was in the background. But now people are getting afraid and thinking and calculating how they will come through. And I think there will be pressure on wages. And so far the wage rise was very, was rather slow. If you see what how the inflation rate is accelerates. So I think this year will be the main issue, how wages and wage negotiations will, what will be the number in the next rounds. We will see. Will they sort of really try to compensate for inflation, and that means that we will see really
in Denmark, I think,
a steep rise of wage costs, and I think Melanie Fogelbach will know better what sort of problem this will pose for companies.
Well, in Denmark we're talking 3.5%, I think, as on average.
3.1 is the latest number for December, but the January figure is going to be a lot higher than that.
So that is what I've been hearing, that 3.5% will be the average for wage increases in this country.
Wages, sorry, I thought.
For wages.
Yeah.
Well, it depends. I think Heike Göbel is making is a precise, correct point here. It really depends on how the wage negotiation system absorbs or overcompensates or undercompensates. And in Denmark, it always strikes me as a foreigner that when you see the bosses of the labor unions or the bosses of the employer-employee meetings, I promise you, as a foreigner, you couldn't tell who is who, right? Everyone says exactly the same thing about competitiveness and wage competitiveness, and you can't tell the difference. And that's why I tend to believe that there will be basically absorb that we won't see excessive wage movements in Denmark. I think the system has proven very solid to accommodate business concerns in those negotiations compared to other European countries, where this quickly could spiral out of control.
And that's why a question by Sven Bankwitz in connection with inflation. How is interest rate development seen in the next months during 22? And are there effects expected on mortgage stability and affordability in Denmark? So, question to you both. Who wants to take it?
I wish I knew.
Who wants to take the first shot here?
So, we can only say that, of course, the direction is up for interest rates. We have already seen a substantial increase in long-term bond yields, which is the most important thing for the Danish mortgage market. Most likely short-term interest rates will start to increase at some point. It might be this year, it might be not. So the signals from the ECB are a little bit mixed. Of course, from Denmark's perspective, we would like to see, for Denmark, it would be beneficial to have monetary policy tightening for sure. But we are following, because of the fixed exchange rate, we are following the same policy as the ECB, and that is, of course, fitted to the average of Europe. So they're probably not going to. It's not going to be tight enough from a Danish perspective. So we are not afraid that this is the thing that might really undermine the housing market. Other than, of course, in local areas, you might see some effects, because through this period of extremely low interest rates, we have seen that the divergence between the various parts of the housing market has become very, very large. And that is sort of logical, but it also means that once you start to see interest rates increase, you might see some convergence between various parts. And the average housing market is not expensive. We're not concerned about that, but we could definitely start to see some problems in the more expensive parts of the housing market, I would say.
Now, Philipp has mentioned the exchange rate, and now you have mentioned it too. Do you see the krona coming under pressure? Do you see? Is it imaginable that the krona will leave the system? And
in this universe, it's not going to happen that the krona is going to leave the system. So that's for sure. That's not going to happen. But we could. Then again, being an economist, I might not have enough fantasy for these sort of things. But having said that, I think we could see a remake of 2015 when we basically where there's an upwards pressure, which is easy to handle, but it still is a lot of drama, but it's nothing that threatens.
I think that was at the time in 2015 when economists actually started talking about the possibility of the krona leaving.
But it would be the quickest way to deindustrialize in Denmark, and that's why it's not going to happen, right? So.
Yeah, I agree that. So there's a lot of political capital tied up in that as well. So also for that reason, it's not going to happen. But you can see these fluctuations, and like you say, 2015 was an example. It's a free bet. If you think there's even the slightest chance that Denmark would leave and the kroner would strengthen, then you can buy kroner, and if it happens, you make a lot of money. If it doesn't happen, you really don't lose anything. And that mechanism can come into play again, of course.
But 2015 was different because a lot of international capital couldn't tell the difference between Switzerland and Denmark. I think they have done the lectures. They have realized
and the central bank showed very clearly what they are thinking about people who will speculate that way, and how they will treat them. So
we have another question here. About Ukraine, and if I want to paraphrase this, it's about a negative price shock, I think, that would be seeing if Russia was to invade Ukraine. How would we cope with a negative price shock in both countries? Would there be a huge difference? I'd imagine that it would be easier for Denmark than for Germany.
Again, we have less reliance on gas. So for that reason.
That's the basic channel, really. But it would probably be quite bad.
I would worry somewhat about the Danish exposure of certain business areas that are very present because of it's a high wage country, so a lot of production processes are taking place both in Ukraine and actually in Russia, more than you would think. So a lot of larger business in Denmark have sort of created global presence, and I think there is a geopolitical risk could be painful for parts of the economy, because Denmark doesn't have a Mittelstand like in Germany in a sense. So you have either very big companies, and they will be exposed to both Ukraine and Russia at varying degrees. And I have a hard time assessing how that will fire back into the economy.
Markus Haas of the German Embassy has a question. Any black swan events aside, how do you see the national debt developing in Denmark and Germany? Well, where do we stand in Denmark? What is it, 20% or 30% of GDP?
No, it's the gross debt is I think it's 35% of GDP or something like that. But that doesn't really tell you anything, because the net financial debt is positive. So there's a net financial asset of the public sector because they also own bonds and stocks. So there is really no national debt from the government. We are on the edge of a period now where we will have 20 years where the demographics are a bit negative. So potentially during that period, you could see some increase in the public debt. But it's if all these plans and everything else stick together, then I think we will be at very, very low levels of sort of net public debt in Denmark for eternity. And so Philipp mentioned that you cannot tell the employers and employees apart, and we also have this very stringent system. All this is a consequence of a very bad history, because back in the 70s, for example, in Denmark, things were completely out of control in terms of public finances, also in terms of the labor market, and the scare from that has sort of forced us into this opposite situation now, where everybody is out responsibility each other.
And different parties across the spectrum have sort of locked each other into fiscal discipline. So that's going to stay.
In Germany, it's a bit different. We started into Corona with a debt to GDP ratio of 60%, which is quite low and in accord with the European rules. But now it has jumped to around about 70 something. And now the big question comes, if we, how do we sort of finance climate action? We have the Corona debt, and I think part of the government thinks, we have to make more, or we have to use. We have to finance part of the investment for climate action via additional public debt. And I think the German government could very well run into conflict with its constitution and the government has a vote to respect our constitution from next year on. At the moment, we are still in a situation where we can pile up higher debt because of Corona. But I think from next year on, this is no excuse, and this will. So I'm a bit worried. I'm not sure which way we will go, and if the Liberal Democrats will be strong enough to keep the country financially or fiscally solid as they plan or vote to do.
Although we have a fiscally conservative chancellor in Germany.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good answer. Yeah.
but isn't the issue in a sense how the European stand on fiscal policy will evolve? Because usually, at least from my perspective, Germany has been sort of the warden of fiscal discipline throughout Europe, right? And I wonder if that role is vacated currently, right? At least for me, it's hard to tell.
Well, we have the frugal four. We still have the frugal four. Yeah.
Well, the new government has many plans, many challenges ahead that we talked about earlier. And so they have many plans on what to do, especially with regards to decarbonisation. And at the moment, there is a debate that all the ministers of the German government want more money for the plans to put them into action that they have for their departments. And so that's the discussion that is going on at the moment, the fiscal discipline versus all the expenditures that are needed for the plans that they made in the coalition.
Although it reminds me of a delegation that we had over here. I think it was after the 2017 elections, the German elections, and people in the delegation told us here in Denmark that the problem with Germany was the government had too much money, and I think some of that problem is still there.
I'm not sure. I think Corona sort of made clear that the money is gone now, and the social system also needs more subsidies at the moment. And so I think the problem is not that the government has too much money to spend. I think that is the thing they see quite clearly. But for this year they have sort of some leeway, and from next year on we will find out how they really think on respecting the constitution and the debt break, or if they find other excuses to pile up more debt. And it will be an interesting experiment, I think.
Okay, so it's 16:58. There's time for one more question or one more comment here from your side.
I could add that the government having too much money is maybe more of a problem in Denmark now, since everything every year it's a positive surprise on the fiscal government finances and so on. And what that does is partly to reduce sort of the urgency of the first thing that Philipp mentioned, which is that when you have such a huge public sector as we do in Denmark, it is necessary to have this pressure to sort of keep it competitive and keep it sort of efficient. And that weakens when there's this feeling of we always go above budget anyway. So.
Okay.
I think the German government really has to tackle the task of accelerating planning procedure. I think, just to quote the German economist Clemens Fuß yesterday, he said speeding up infrastructure planning and building is the biggest challenge for the new government. If it fails, we will not be able to reach our ambitious climate goals. And I think if you can speed up those procedures, we'll save a lot of money as well. And so there is a task at hand which doesn't cost money, but
the question is, can it be done? Well, if it was easy, it had been done before.
Maybe, but sometimes if
a matter of urgency. Well, it's obviously also something that has been noted in Denmark with regard to the Fehmarn Belt connection, really, where the Danes were pretty hopeful that they'd have the Fehmarn Tunnel up and running in 2018. But they hadn't really looked at what a Planfeststellungsverfahren means. in Germany. So we are here 2022 now, and we have just begun.
Yeah, but
now.
we are lucky it hasn't been stopped at all by by those by justice at the moment. We lost.
But also from the business perspective, that's really speeding up all these procedures. I mean, it's obviously important for our renewable energy sources. Heike Göbel mentioned that earlier, but it's also for businesses, for all projects, all investments. If companies have to wait for months and months and years to be able to put major projects into action, it's that's a huge challenge. And as Heike Göbel said, that's something that could be done, reducing even the costs and not having to spend more.
You see, Tesla nearly is about to start production cars in Germany, but it still doesn't have all the regular permissions to do it. And this was a quick procedure so far. So it's, I think that's a point where we really have to see some progress.
Okay. Well, in order to sum up, I'd say in the short term, everything's fine. We have solid economies in Germany and in Denmark. We do have an inflation problem, maybe lurking, and we have to deal with that. And in the longer term, there are quite a few challenges, both in Germany and in Denmark. Thank you for being with us. Thank you, Heike Göbel and Melanie Vogelbach from Frankfurt and Berlin. Thank you to Philipp Schröder and Lars Olsen here at our studio. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today in this session. You are going to get a very small questionnaire in which you can rate this event, tell us if you liked it, and also tell us what we can do better next time. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Have a nice day.
Bye from Berlin.
Bye-bye.